sat directly in front of him. His eyes widened and his mind buzzed. So this girl has joined the class. Now, one thing that I didn't tell you that I skipped over, since Jackson doesn't have a father, and he feels very strongly he has a need for learning masculinity. He doesn't know it. If Jackson were here, he couldn't tell you this. But what he likes to do is he watches movies with like strong leading men. And he watches these old classic black and white films. And this has been his only real male role model in his whole life, are the Humphrey Bogarts of the world, right? And so as this girl comes in, he tells himself, be cool, be like Bogart. In his mind, he replayed all the best scenes from The Big Sleep and a dozen other noir classics he had seen, in which a tall, mysterious woman suddenly entered the life of a jaded protagonist. If you just play it cool and don't seem too eager, he told himself, she'll throw herself at you. Remember how that girl closed down the bookshop for Philip Marlowe? You can be ugly and rough, but as long as you play it cool, you're in. This is what he thinks, right? Diana was instructed to sit in front of Jackson, just as he'd expertly deduced. Now all he had to do was wait for her to turn to him and say, what are you doing later? Or, I need your help desperately. Or, I'm in grave danger. While he waited, he used his private eye's mind to take in every detail about her that was available to him. She dressed for cold weather, even though it had been unseasonably humid all day, with long sleeves and even a light scarf wrapped around her neck. She wore black. Everything from her fingernails to her Chuck Taylors was black. Over this, she wore confidence. Jackson knew she would turn around and change his life any moment. He waited and waited. While he waited, his left foot began to tap on the floor, in sync with his right thumb drumming on his desk. His frenetic energy poured out wherever it could, and the longer the moment took to arrive, the worse it got, until his cool no longer existed. Finally, Deglin nudged him from behind, pushing him to his breaking point. Jackson could hold back no longer. Hey, hello, girl! Jackson's loud whisper seemed not to affect the ears in front of him, so he pushed against her desk with his feet until she had no choice but to turn around. When she finally faced him, Jackson couldn't read the annoyed look on her face. I'm Jackson, he said, Jackson Porter. And so this is where he introduces her, but guess what? Bad news for Jackson. She wants nothing to do with him, right? So a couple days pass with him trying to get her attention, and finally, she drops him a note and she says, meet me in the girls' bathroom, and he thinks this is going to be this incredible moment. He says, this is it, right? I'm going to go there and she's just going to come on to me and that's everything. Well, when he gets there, she tells him, she says, look, I want you to do something for me. He says, okay. She says, I want you to close your eyes. He says, okay. She says, I want you to hold my hand. He says, okay. And she says, and I want you to think of an animal. He says, what? All right? He thinks that's not how this is supposed to go. And so he does. He says, okay. And the only thing he could think of is the most recent thing that they had been talking about in his science class, which is a giant manta ray. So he says, okay, manta ray. And she holds his hand, and then they have this vision that they share. And he blacks out for a moment, and he feels like he is a giant manta ray floating through the ocean. And this is his reaction when that's over. When he came to, Jackson instinctively jerked his hands away from Diana, launched himself to the toilet, and proceeded to lose his lunch. You're seasick, Diana said. You'll feel back to normal in a few minutes, don't worry. The hell'd you just do to me? Jackson fired back between heaves. Even if you weren't seasick, it makes sense that you're shaken right now. I understand. I went through the same thing my first time. Your first time? What are you talking about? What was that? Take this, Diana said, shoving a composition book into Jackson's shaking hands. Write down everything you remember about what just happened. Everything you saw, felt, experienced. Don't leave out a single detail. Got it? As soon as Jackson reflexively grabbed what he'd been offered, Diana let go and turned to leave. You're nuts. I got no idea what that was, but I'm sure as hell not doing homework about it. Jackson waited for a response, but a moment later, he found himself standing alone in the girls' bathroom. When he returned to class, Jackson looked at the clock. 3:05. Why did it feel like I was gone for hours, he thought. He was still confused during his walk home, but he couldn't stop turning the experience over in his mind, replaying what he'd seen and felt in the girls' bathroom. He was equally confused by his own actions this time when he actually opened up the composition book and, just as Diana had instructed, began writing. And I will tell you, I'm going to read this first entry that he makes. Jackson is not a great student, and when my editor read this section, his notes to me were, ouch, this was the hardest thing I've ever read, and I had told him, don't correct that section, it's full of intentional mistakes. So it'll be one thing when I read it, but if you look at it, you'll see every misspelling and every incorrect capitalization in here, because this is where he's starting out sort of on his journey. Well, at first it was really dark and I couldn't see nothing, and I felt like I was just floating, like in emptiness or space or something. But then I realized I was in the ocean. But it was still really dark, so I must have been really deep. Or maybe I just had bad eyesight, and I couldn't hear much of nothing neither. But I tried really hard to see, and then I could see that on the sides I had these big fins like triangles. But I couldn't see nothing in front of me, and that's when I realized that I was a manta ray, just like I said. And I felt like I really was it, not just thinking of it, like in my imagination. And then it was a lot easier to understand what was happening. Even though I couldn't see good, I could sort of feel what was around me, like other fish and probably other manta rays, sort of like a swarm, I think. And even though it was dark or I couldn't see in front of me, it felt really peaceful, just sort of floating there like I did. And I liked that, and I liked to know that there was other mantas there too. And we sort of just floated up and down with our fins for hours. But we kept moving forward too, because we couldn't stop moving forward. But it was still nice to just float, I think. The end. So this is his first entry. And I'll let you guys in on a little secret. Each of these experiences that he has sort of mirrors where he is in his life. And I think that's pretty obvious when you read it. So this first one, where is he in his life as he's sort of floating through in the darkness? He doesn't know where he's going. He doesn't have any direction. Well, before I continue, does anyone have any questions or anything we want to talk about? Okay, maybe that's the teacher in me coming out. I need to pause and talk to the class. So here's what I'm going to read, just a couple more things. I'm going to read a conversation that he has with Diana after that, where he's written his journal entry. And then I'm also going to read the next journal entry he has, and we see how this is sort of helping him improve. Suddenly he's a capable writer and things like that in the next one. But here's what he says to her. When he sees her next. Jesus! Really? Jackson continued the conversation. What was that anyway? How'd you see in my imagination? Hey, come on. It wasn't your imagination, Porter. You were inside that manta ray's mind looking out. You were experiencing his life for real. You're nuts. That ain't possible. Think about what you saw and what you felt. You really don't believe that was real? Didn't it feel real to you? Well, yeah, it did, but how? That's impossible. Not impossible, Diana said. Magic. Oh, God. Jackson rolled his eyes. If Diana weren't a girl, he would have lost his patience by now. As it was, though, he remained patient only because he was trying to make the story he told Deglin about what happened in the bathroom a reality. You ain't one of them devil worshippers, are you? You look like you could be. No, Porter, I'm not a devil worshipper. You'll understand it all in time, but for now I just need you to trust me. Do you wear a foxtail and a collar like them girls at school? No, those are just children playing make-believe. This is real. Okay, fine, let's say you do have magic. Fine. What all can you do? Like, shoot lightning or something? No, Diana said. I can put your mind and my mind into an animal so we can experience what they experience. That's pretty much it. Well, that's lame. Why? I'm not really sure. I just know that when we can with an animal, it helps us better understand human nature. It helps us better understand ourselves. Ken? That's what it's called, for us at least. I think there may have been other versions of the Ken in the past with other names. And maybe there still are in other cultures, like a walkabout or a vision quest, or any number of rites of passage. I think it's like that. So lots of people do this? Jackson asked. No, not a lot. It's not like that. I can only ken with one person, and I chose you. Okay, but what's the point? Think about your life, Porter. Really be honest with yourself. Would you say you have a good life? He was about to say that he did, but he stopped himself. He remained silent while Diana continued. Would you say that your life is easy? That things come easily to you? Or that you struggle? You struggle to sit still, to concentrate, to understand, and deal with your emotions. Well, shoot, I guess I might struggle a bit sometimes. That's what I thought when I saw you in class, so I chose you. Still don't understand what it's all about, though. Like, for what? All right. You just told me that your writing was bad, right? But you know as well as I do that you've been taught how to write since kindergarten. You've learned grammar and punctuation and things like that. You must have. It's in there in your mind, but you can't access it for some reason. Or at least you don't. Well, the next time you write about this or anything else, you'll notice that your writing is a little bit better. It may fluctuate some as we go, but eventually you'll arrive at a much higher level than you're at now. Same with math and everything else. It'll come a little bit more easily. Because when we do this, when we can, it sort of unlocks your brain. And it's not just school either. Your emotions will be easier to deal with. Your behavior will change. You'll still be you, I promise, but a more complete version of yourself. And so that's really the goal of the book, is to see Jackson grow into this complete version of himself. All right? And so I want to just skip ahead to his next Ken. And I think I'm intentionally avoiding introducing some of the subplots because I know myself, if I start talking about what's going on with his mom and his mom's boyfriend and and his best friend, I'm going to want to read the whole thing out loud to you. All right? So I'm just focusing on sort of setting up the situation. So he and Diana are sitting down 2 weeks later. They're going to have their next Ken, their next magical vision here. And she tells him to focus on something a little bit different. She says, there's one thing I think you should try. And I want you to try to do it differently this time. Try to focus on the senses. Animals experience the world in different ways than us. You got a little bit of that with the manta ray. How you couldn't see in front of you, that makes sense, right? Because the manta's eyes are on the side of its head. And how you could feel the other animals around you. Well, mantas have electroreceptors, so that makes sense too. So this time I want you to focus on how the animal you choose actually experiences the world differently than you, through different senses. And when you write in your journal, really try to describe what you experienced. It will make things easier. Senses. All right. I'll try that. Great. Have you chosen an animal yet? Despite his excitement for today's Ken, thinking of an animal ahead of time hadn't crossed Jackson's mind at all. He tried not to be obvious in his choice, but as he searched his mind, the only thing he could come up with was the school mascot. A bear. Let's do a bear. And so then we see his experience, his entry. I'd been sleeping for a long time, but now I was awake and very hungry. Food was my first thought. I pulled myself out of my den and into the light. It was morning. My muscles were stiff, I think because I must have been hibernating. It meant it was springtime now. It felt good to be awake and finally moving my body. I stood outside the den on all four legs. They were wobbly. The ground below my feet was still cold and hard, but it felt good to breathe in fresh air. I stuck my nose up into the air and inhaled. I did it a few times. With each breath, I got better at understanding what was around me. All kinds of trees that were refreshing, crisp, I guess. I could smell grass and flowers starting to come up. The wind carried the smells to me almost like a river of smells floating on the air. Like when you see a scent trail in an old cartoon. Somehow I knew that each smell was, I knew what each smell was, like I had a memory of it already. I could see the whole world through my nose. There was so much to take in, but something else grabbed my attention. I heard a sound coming from inside my den, a sort of rustling. I was so sidetracked by the smells all around me that I didn't notice that I wasn't alone. That's when two little cubs came out of the den behind me. Then I realized I was a mother bear, a girl bear. I noticed that my chest was sore where the cubs must have been suckling. And suddenly I knew that I didn't just need to take care of my own hunger, but theirs too. I tried looking around, but I couldn't see anything I wanted to eat. So next, I listened. I heard the wind come whooshing through the trees and over the mountain slope where we were standing. I heard some water far off, but without even thinking about it, my nose took over again. I sniffed the air several times, sucking in the scents and almost turning them over in my head until I knew what was around me. It was like I could map out the world around me for miles just using my nose. But I wasn't concerned about things miles away. I wanted the closest meal I could find. The cubs trotted along behind me as I moved down the slope, rocking my weight from one leg to another. I followed my nose to a patch of ground not far away. My long claws sunk into the cold dirt, and I pulled up a bundle of roots. It was an easy meal, but I devoured it immediately, and after it was gone, I was still hungry. The cubs were hungry too. We ate grass and leaves and anything near us. The lower we went down the slope, the more plants there were, but I worried that it wouldn't be filling enough, nutritious enough. I felt the urge to eat something more than just grass, because I knew my cubs would need my milk again soon. Suddenly, a scent struck me like a bolt of lightning. I lifted my face into the air again. My nose twitched. There was meat nearby. That's what I needed. That's what we needed. I turned and moved straight toward the smell. It was strong. It pulled me toward it. The cubs followed along behind me, keeping up the best they could. It took us almost an hour to find what I had smelled, and along the way we crossed a stream of cold water that ran down from the melting snow higher up the slope. I'd never tasted water so clean and fresh. Finally, when we entered the meadow, I saw it. It was a small deer. It must have died during the winter, and now with the snow around its body melting away, it was just sitting there waiting for us. I ran to it and tore in. I wanted to lose myself in eating, but my mind was focused constantly on the cubs. Even though my nose was buried in the animal's carcass and my mind was focused on my teeth tearing meat off the bone, I was aware of the cubs and all that was going on around me. My instincts stopped my eating. My ears turned like satellite dishes when I heard something approach. I pulled my head up and sniffed the air again. Another bear was coming. I could smell it clearly now. Somehow, I knew it was a male bear just by the smell. No, not yet. Please, I'm still hungry. My cubs will suckle again soon, and I'm still hungry. They need me to be strong. Without thinking, I turned and huffed at the cubs to nudge them toward the nearest pine tree. They climbed and hid. At the same moment, a large bear stepped from the line of trees nearby. He looked strong. His massive head pointed straight at us, with his square muzzle and powerful jaws showing me just how strong he was. I could see that he had a hunger in his eyes that equaled my own. I turned and positioned myself between the cubs and the newcomer, and I huffed again, louder this time. It was almost a snort. I snapped my jaws together, I clicked my teeth repeatedly, I stood straight up, then came back down. The whole time, the other bear continued to eye the carcass. I watched as he sniffed the air. He could have the meat, but I couldn't let him detect the cubs behind me. The last thing I wanted was to fight him. I knew a fight meant certain injury even for the winner, and injury meant I couldn't care for my cubs. I had to chase him away. With my head lowered and my ears flattened, I made a quick charge at him. I stopped at the last second, inches away from him with my mouth open, and I huffed again. Then slowly I backed away. He could have the meat. I didn't want anything but to protect the cubs. The last thing I remember is him rearing up on his hind legs as I tried to retreat. And that's the end of the entry. And then we jump back to Jackson's first words to Diana afterwards. He says, "What the hell? It just stopped. Let me go back in. I need to know what happened." And so we see in that second one, he's starting to come out of the darkness, and he's starting to get to understand the world around him a little bit better, at least symbolically in that way. So talk to me. What do you want to do? Do you want me to keep reading? Do you have questions? Do you have any questions about the writing process or the title of the book or anything like that? Yes?
Michael, one of the things that I really liked about the book was the way that you really went right into, like from Jackson's story into the animal. It's like a seamless sort of a transition.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Woolsey, Nathan has read it already, and he's just here to support me, and I appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah, I said to myself again as I was writing this, who's my audience and who did I have in mind? And you know, these days, adults read young adult fiction just as much as young adults read young adult fiction. But I'm thinking of the kids in my class who are the struggling readers, and I thought, you know, every student is going to know, or every reader is going to know at the end of a chapter, if they are bored by whatever's going on in Jackson's life, they know that chapter is going to end with something about an animal, right? And when I was growing up, and even now, I love animals, right? My wife says I should quit being a teacher and work at the zoo because I love animals. And that was one of the great things about writing this, is I said, you know, I'm going to write about some of these amazing things that animals do and their amazing senses and things like this. And I thought, that was the two things that I really liked to throw in there on a sort of symbolic level. He brings in these animals and what's going on with them, and he also, I love classic films, and so he brings in these classic films, and we sort of have this triangle between those three different things and this juxtaposition. So thank you. And I tried to think about what was, hold on a second, everybody. Nico, it's okay.
Come over here to that.
So anyway, I was thinking about what are some of the amazing things about the animal world, because I don't know, maybe I'm going to sound like a hippie or something. I look at the trees in my front yard and I think trees are amazing, right? I look at trees after it rains and they're all like swollen. I think it's just incredible. And so I was thinking about how can I bring some of that into this. And so there's one part, not to go through every single event in the book, but there's one part where he's going through and he's starting to really transform, and so he's a caterpillar. And I don't know how many of you guys know this. Probably you do. I hope this is common knowledge. But when a caterpillar changes into a butterfly and it builds that chrysalis, it doesn't just like grow wings and fly out. It completely liquefies. Like it turns into a goop. And I think this is a miracle, right? It turns into a goop and then it reconstitutes as a completely different animal. And it's just incredible. Like the natural world blows my mind. And so to bring that in and to sort of have Jackson have these revelations and to see these things, and then to come away from that changed. You know, one of my early readers had mentioned that in some places it seems like he changes very, very quickly, and I didn't know if they meant that as a good or a bad thing, but I wanted that to happen because there's magic in this book, right? I know this is not how, when I see that struggling kid, he's not going to be up here 2 weeks later just because he had a single experience. But I want Jackson to sort of have this accelerated version of learning how to be a responsible adult, just so he can manage the crap in his own life, you know, and the struggles in his own life. And the animals are the way to do that, right? They're the tool to do that. Yeah. So thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah. And it's over the course of a year too.
Yeah. It takes place. It starts in the fall, and you know. Again, not to give away, not to show the magic trick too much or whatever, but it takes place in the fall when things are dying, and it ends in the springtime when things are coming back to life, right? And so we see Jackson go through this transition where he's coming alive at the end, and he's at this better place in his life. So there's a little bit of symbolism. Good. Any other questions or comments or anything? Yes.
So as far as research goes, when you're doing all the different the science aspects or if you're doing hunting or mating or whatever the scene is with the animal, did you do a lot of extensive research or
yes.
did you kind of, okay.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. Yeah, I did. So I'm a school teacher and I wrote this over a summer vacation, so I had 2 months off before my son, it was the year before my son was born. So my wife would go to work and I would just wake up at the same time I would wake up normally if I was going to teach. And I would go to my little home office and I would work all day. And and I had a minimum number of words that I had to write each day that I set for myself. But some of my work day was watching Casablanca again for the 100th time, or watching a documentary or 10 about bears, or reading about butterflies and that process, and things like that. And actually, the title Coywolf is an animal that Jackson has an experience with towards the end of the novel, where things have finally clicked with him. And a coy wolf is an actual animal it's a hybrid between a coyote and a wolf. And I think that it was really important to choose an animal for Jackson to really click with that was not the same as what had come before, right? So this is a hybrid animal where, it's part wolf, it's part coyote. Jackson is not going to be who his mom is, and he's not going to be whoever his father was. He's not that. He's going to be a new thing, and his own man by the end of this, right? And so to research that and to read about how hybrid animals work and how the coy wolf became a thing, I read a lot of articles and I watched some documentaries and things like that. This was the most joyful thing to write, because people say write about things that you love and write about things, or do what you love and write about things you know about. Well, guess what? I took things that I'm passionate about, which is animals and film and young people, right? Because I wouldn't be a teacher if I wasn't passionate about young people, and I blended them all together, and that's how we arrived at Coywolf. And of course, when the novel ends, Jackson is at the end of his freshman year in high school. He still is not, look at the young people in the room today. I hate to say it, even though you're high school graduates, your life is still like you're at the beginning of your life's journey, right? Well, Jackson, at the end of his freshman year of high school, maybe he's figured out how to deal with the problems in his life, but it doesn't mean the problems in his life are gone, right? And so we're gonna see. I'm working on the next one. My writing process is a lot slower now because I have a wonderful excuse to spend time on things other than writing. I've got my son, so it's taking a lot longer for the second one. But with the sequel, we see that he's applying all of these lessons and all these changes, and just like all of us, as soon as we think we have things figured out, that's when we realize that we don't, right? And we make some big mistakes, and we've got to sort of scramble and figure it out and say, ooh, I was a little overconfident, or I'm not quite where I thought I was. So at the end, it's definitely a complete journey for Jackson, but we also, just like life, unless he's dead, the journey's not over, right? And so there's more that I'm working on telling, because I just can't let this world go. I'm still passionate about young people, and I'm still passionate about this character Jackson that I created, and I'm passionate about exploring the world in this way. So this is its own thing. And if something, not to sound morbid, sorry, but if I were in a car accident and whatever, and I couldn't write a second one, it's done. It's a complete thing, and I'm proud of what this is. But also at the same time, I feel like I want to dive back into this world and continue to explore where he's going next. Hopefully, if life lets me. Question.
Yes. Do you feel that if
This is my mom, everybody.
Do you feel that if counselors had access to this, they could use this as a tool helping adolescents?
I hope that counselors have better tools, but I think that there are a lot of kids who are not going to counselors who probably could benefit from going to counselors, and probably are going it alone. And I think that that's who Jackson is as well. And so I hope that God knows this is not going to take the place if somebody really needs to go talk to somebody and really needs help. But hopefully this sort of book in the right hands would let a young person know that there is help out there, and that there is growth, and that you're having the worst day of your life today doesn't mean every day is going to be the worst day of your life, because Jackson's having the worst day of his life and he doesn't even know it. That's how bad it is, right? He's at a place where he doesn't even realize he's in the darkness, right? And then somebody turns on the light and he realizes that there's light out there, right? And so hopefully this is for the kids and anybody, I guess. I'm a little biased, but I enjoy it as an adult reading it. To realize or to reinforce that there is growth, right? There's a place to go. It's not the end, you know. Everybody who's around young adults knows how many of them are constantly on the edge, right? And so to let them understand, you know, you're not alone. Here's a student, or here's a young person who is like you, who is going through some terrible things at home. One of my favorite parts to write not in a fun, exciting, positive way, but one of my favorite parts to write was Jackson has probably the worst Thanksgiving dinner ever in the history of Thanksgiving, and in some very bad adult situations, some bad things happen. There are some unsavory characters at his house, and people are not treated very well, and things like that. There's some levity to it as well, right? But it's this word. You think of a feast, and anytime you read a novel or classic literature when there's feasting happening, right? When you read anything from the Odyssey 3,000 years ago on up till now, feasts have symbolism. It's about a community coming together and things like that. And in this Thanksgiving dinner that he has, it's like the destruction, you know, of any community that he thought that he had. Yeah, exactly. It's the anti-feast. It's everything is falling apart. But then we recover from that, right? We recover from that, and this is a series of failing and recovering throughout this novel. And if there's a second one, then it will be a continuation of failing and recovering and failing and recovering, because that's life. I think everybody in here is doing that every day, is failing and recovering. So, good
Michael,
question.
have you had much response from your students that have read it?
Yes, so this is Lisa Murphy. She's the librarian at Milton High School, and actually Lisa got a few copies of it in the library this year, and I've had students come and talk to me and tell me that they've really enjoyed it. I have several former students here who have read it, who I believe have enjoyed it, or they wouldn't be here, you know. And I have had students who have mentioned, you know, all sorts of things, the things that I liked. I had students tell me that they liked all the parts about animals and things like that, which good, you know, so that kept you engaged. But I've also had students tell me they get what he's going through because they're going through the same thing, or they've never known their dad and their mom sucks, sorry, you know, and things like that, just like in Jackson's life. And so I have had students say, like, I felt like that was me in that book, and I was like, well, I wrote it before I had you as a student, so like I wasn't basing it on your life or anything, but they said, but I feel like, how'd you know? You know, is what they say. How'd you know what I'm going through? And so I have had it, and that's really heartwarming, because that's the point. You know, that was the goal for a lot. You know, for me, for my motivation. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Apart from noir and nature documentary, were there any other genres of film that informed the book at all?
Yeah. I said to myself, I want, if I made a list of 10 movies to give to a kid, to give, especially a young man, and you know, boys and girls will read and benefit from this book, and that's fine, but my protagonist is a young man, and I thought, if I could make a list of 10 movies to give to a young man and say, this is what, they're all American films in this one, and so this is what America thinks that manhood is, watch these movies. That's sort of what I looked at, and so they're all classic films, but it's not just noir. I talk about James Dean and Rebel Without a Cause in there, and there's this moment where Jackson identifies with that. I don't know if you are familiar with the film, but James Dean character yells to his parents, "You're tearing me apart!" Right? And there's this moment where he makes that connection, where his world is just chaos around him, and he's identifying with that. I talk about The Wild One with Marlon Brando, who's a biker, and he walks around with this swagger, and he feels like he's in control of the whole world. And Jackson really strongly identifies with Paul Newman, and so he watches what I think is one of the best films ever to come out of, you know, the history of film, which is Cool Hand Luke, and he watches Cool Hand Luke, and he connects with that, and he just thinks about how, not to spoil what happens in Cool Hand Luke, but you know, things don't go his way. And it's about the main character is in jail, and he keeps escaping and getting dragged back to jail. But there's a lot of symbolism in there, and at the end, you know, Jackson says that he wishes that Paul Newman was his father and could come and sit down and tell him everything's going to be okay, but that's not how it is. You know, and so yeah, I really looked at American classics from, you know, from the silent era. You know, I have some references to Charlie Chaplin in there, who was a genius, and his speech at the end of The Great Dictator, where he talks of, it's basically a spoof on dictatorships in the 1930s in Europe, and is what that film is about. And he talks about humanity and how, you know, don't let the world turn you into automatons, and, you know, be a real thinking, caring human. That's what you're here for. And so Jackson, you know, watches that, and he sort of is affected by that. So a whole gamut of American classics, and trying to look at those specifically in this book. Look at the concept of masculinity, and Jackson is surrounded by, in the beginning of the book especially, people who fit one definition of masculinity, and he goes through his personal journey and learns that maybe that's not the only definition of what it means to be a man, right? And so by the end, he sort of rejects that a little bit and moves somewhere else as a person. Good, really good question. Yeah, if you're a movie lover, I'm a movie lover too, and I definitely tried to weave that in here. Yeah. Good question. Yes.
I have one more. Sorry.
No, don't be.
So I know this is Jackson's story.
Yes.
But you have Diana Shepherd, and I don't know if you chose the last name as because she's the shepherding him through these
Is the
things.
shepherd now? Yeah, I Is there?
Yes. Yeah. So I guess my question is, so is she more of like a vessel for his autonomy in this book, or is she a fully fledged character with a background and her own agenda?
Yes, she very much is a fully fledged character with her own journey as well. We get it as Jackson gets it, though. So in the beginning, and I was keenly aware of this as I was writing it. I was afraid that people would read the first chapter and feel like she's just a cipher, you know. But it was important to me to stay true to the fact that as Jackson is evolving, he's learning to understand other people better. And so for a long time, she just represents to Jackson femininity, right? And she's a girl, and that's why I'm still talking to her, because she's a girl, and I want what all teenage boys want, you know. And he's not really thinking of her own struggles and her own journey. But then there's a point in his process where he gets it, and then he gets her backstory, and then it all sort of falls into place. And we can look back at every experience and every description of her up to that point, and we understand why she is the way she is. And then in the second half of the book, I feel like we start to focus on her almost as much as we focus on him, and we sort of see, you know, he's going through his journey, but once they are together, their journeys become parallel, and she's going through her journey as well, right? And so, so yes, that's a great question. So she does shepherd him, but I also chose for her first name, Diana, the goddess of the hunt, because I like that contradiction, and I wanted there to be sort of a contradiction, but this connection to nature, and she definitely is shepherding him, but she is also definitely making her own moves, and she has her own motivations as well. And I could talk about the names in the book probably for 2 hours, and the symbolism behind them, you know. I don't think I've had other discussions about the book with some other people, and I did an interview with somebody, and I don't think I revealed this, but, you know, he chooses his last name Porter in a way, and a porter is somebody who carries heavy burdens, right? And so he's carrying heavy burdens. So, I mean, porters have the word porter has other meanings, but somebody who carries burdens is a porter. So, so there's some symbolism to his name as well, and a lot of the side characters as well. Good questions. Any other questions? Do you want me to read more? Do you want to? Yes.
What is an industrial earring? And part and two?
Yes.
What are Chuck Taylors?
Okay, so
Oh.
these are things also, because I'm not always hip and with it, that I also had to
looking
like
around to see if anybody has
research
any
the
on that.
terms for, right? So Chuck Taylor is a type of sneaker,
Yeah.
and an industrial earring is like, it's like a bar
Oh, okay.
earring. Yeah, so that's I did not know the term for that either, and I had to find out. And I could have consulted some of my young friends, but I didn't. I just sort of used my Google magic to figure. Yeah, so you know, because I had to remember that I want these characters to be authentic, and it was important for me sometimes to write outside of my comfort zone and not just write about the things that I know, but learn about the things that this character knows. You know, to make sure that it's authentic. And I think that as a lot of young people are reading it, I would imagine they know those terms without, you know, or they can imagine it without having to scratch their heads. But then there's the other generation. So yeah, absolutely. Yes, sir.
And on that note, you mentioned like furry culture.
Yeah.
Like does that come up at all? Like.
There's really just that one throwaway line to it, and I don't want to be dismissive or insulting to anybody, but at the same time, you know, Jackson has his opinion about that trend, you know, and things like that, and so I just wanted to sort of. There's going to be a point where if there are still copies of this book 20 years from now, that reference will fall flat probably, right? But maybe not, who knows? Yeah. But I felt like, you know, that roots us in our setting and our present time, you know. The same thing, you know, he watches all these classic movies, he watches them on his phone, which is different from my experience watching classic films, right? But, and I watch classic films because I love them. He watches classic films, he finds out they're the easiest ones to find for free. You know, and so because of copyright reasons, or nobody's really, you know, he's not going to go watch Avengers Endgame for free online, but free fits his budget, so he watches the things that he can find, and that's how he sort of discovers some of these things that he then becomes really interested in. So, for all, I tried to think of where are we in 2000. Well, it was 2017, I think, when I wrote it, but where are we, you know, in our culture? So every kid, even the ones that I know that I teach that are on the lower socioeconomic end, everyone has a smartphone. Almost, I would say 98% of my students do, you know, and so that was one thing that I said, well, that's the world that he knows. That's the world that you know, this generation, there were smartphones before they were. Sorry to refer to you guys as the they. You're right here in the room, but they don't know anything else other than smartphones, probably, right? And so that's Jackson's access to a lot of stuff in here, and so I don't think I have a lot of current social trends in there because I worry that it won't age well. But I did mention we actually had an issue at our school with that a few years ago, that it popped up as a trend overnight, and then it sort of died down by now, you know, afterwards for the most part. But and so that's when I sat down to write this, that stuck with me. Not that I was cribbing everything from what actually happened in school that day or anything like that, but I was thinking, oh, well, you know, that did happen. It would be almost disingenuous to ignore that was a trend, you know, since we're talking about animals. So I sort of tied that in. Good question. This is fun for me. I don't know about you guys. Any other questions? Would anybody like to come and look at some copies up here and sort of flip through it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so go ahead and take a look, guys. And just as a reminder, there's lemonade and donuts and stuff in the back.
Yes, if
so
you
please
came
help
in
yourself.
late.
Yes. Okay, ready?
Hey, Kaylee, how are you? Thank you for coming.